Welcome to Good Night with George Galloway on the Malacca Red channel on YouTube, which over 300,000 people have viewed in the last few months. Please spread the word about these podcasts. It's a good way of getting a message to people without having to pass through the filter of Rupert Murdoch's Sky News, not that they're calling me anyway, or the Bush and Blair Corporation, formerly known as the BBC. I'm here to talk to you tonight about the mass murder which is currently taking place in Gaza, an area of Palestine that I have come to know only too well over these last 5.5 years. I mentioned 5.5 years, although I have been visiting Gaza for 30 years. It has always been one of the most miserable places for the 1.6 million Palestinians who live there, most of them as refugees, living in gigantic refugee camps, living in squalor and constantly resisting the Israeli occupation of their land and therefore bearing what has, by any standards, been the brunt of massive and disproportionate violence, paid for by the USA, facilitated by Britain and France and other imperialist countries. The people of Gaza have paid a very high price for their fidelity, their faithfulness to the Palestinian cause. They've paid a very high price for many decades. It's not up to me to choose the leadership of the Palestinian people, and it's certainly not up to Israel or America or Britain. The only people entitled to choose the leadership of the Palestinian people are the Palestinians themselves, and they chose in an election that was described by Jimmy Carter as pristine, crystal clear, perfect in its transparency and in its fairness. Nonetheless, the people of Gaza were immediately blockaded, a tiny piece of land in which getting on for 2 million people live, were suddenly trapped with all the gates locked, including the Arab gate into Egypt, which was blocked by the imperialist stooge, the dictator, the former president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak. And so every time the Israelis began massive bombardment, stepped up the punishment of the Palestinian people in Gaza, the people had nowhere to go, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. If you've ever been in Gaza, you'll know how tiny it is. And yet, these rockets and bombs and phosphorus gas and naval bombardments and shelling from land, from tanks, totally indiscriminate, absolutely without precision, have rained down on apartment blocks, houses, schools, hospitals, all kinds of public facilities have been reduced to rubble and ash. Now, the world has been fixated over the last week by this latest spasm of absolute violence unleashed by the Zionist settler state of Israel upon the virtually defenseless Palestinian people. They have no Iron Dome missile shield, they have no air force, no navy, no army, no heavy weaponry. All they have are firecracker rockets that streak up into the sky and are militarily almost utterly ineffective. But they have no other weapons. The blockade means that they have not even the basic means to defend themselves. Indeed, they don't even have cement to repair their houses destroyed in previous Israeli bombardments. The Palestinian people are virtually defenseless. Certainly none of the Arab regimes, many of whom now have very close relations with Netanyahu's Israel, none of them have lifted a finger to come to the aid of the Palestinian people. And the mass media in the West has been, as always, a constant apologist for the Israeli point of view. We are treated, I can no longer watch it myself, but I read about it. We are treated to the constant verbal, journalistic bombardment that the victims of aggression, the Palestinians, are in fact the villains, the aggressors, that they are attacking Israel rather than Israel attacking them. And this has manifested itself in many different ways over this last period. One of the most infamous was the BBC website, which just a day or two ago gave a report in which they started with the claim that 3 Israelis had been killed by Palestinians, whilst 10 times, 20 times more Palestinians had merely died. I'm not making that up. You can see the screenshot of it. Although it's probably been changed now, you can still see the screenshot of it everywhere on the internet. Now, let me run that past you again. In any normal journalistic story, it would be the 54 or 64 or 74, whatever it is by the time that you see this, it will be their deaths that led the news report, and the 3 Israelis would come second. And all of them would have been killed. Not just the Israelis being killed whilst the others have died. What did they die of? Influenza? They were killed, and they were almost all civilians. In fact, half of them were women and children, and some families lost several of their children. And you can see the pictures if you want to look for them, but you probably won't see them on mainstream television. You almost certainly won't see them in mainstream newspapers. The only conclusion you can draw from this is one I drew many decades ago, namely that Palestinian blood, Lebanese blood, is cheaper than Israeli blood, American blood, British blood. That the deaths of Palestinians are nowhere remotely as newsworthy, as significant as the deaths of others. Now that may be true if you're sitting in the newsroom at Sky News, but it isn't true to the families who lost their children. It isn't true for the families who lost their wives. It isn't true for the great majority of Arabs in the 350 million strong Arab nation which stretches from Marrakesh to Bahrain, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. And it's not true to the 2 billion Muslims in the world who stretch, well, almost everywhere on the globe. And it's this dichotomy which lies at the heart of this crisis. For Western people, Western media, and above all, Western politicians, what happens to the Palestinians, the injustice meted out over 60 years and more for the Palestinians, is of little consequence, but it's of massive consequence to Arabs and Muslims. And that's why the gap is growing wider and wider and wider between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. Israel is currently, savagely, barbarically, murderously mowing down Palestinian children like flies. Just in the last few hours, Israel has admitted that it made a mistake demolishing a house and killing several children and many civilians because it thought wrongly that a Hamas man was in that building. It cannot be otherwise. Don't believe this bull about precision bombardment. These are bombs raining down. There's a naval bombardment going on right now. How precision do you think a naval bombardment is? How precision do you think tank shells are? Gaza is a densely populated, heavily concentrated civilian area. Now, no other country in the world would get away with murdering civilians because it was thought that a fighter, a terrorist, might be in the apartment block that you've just knocked down. The British were at war for decades with the Irish people. Irish Republican fighters were committing serious acts of violence, even almost killing the British Prime Minister and several of her parliamentary colleagues. If the British Air Force had begun bombarding firing rockets, dropping phosphorus gas into nationalist areas in the north of Ireland because it was thought the IRA fighters were in there somewhere. Can you imagine what the outcry in the United States would have been? Can you imagine what the world response would have been? Never mind the British response. No British government would ever have gotten away with such indiscriminate, fascist-style collective punishment and retribution. That's what the fascists used to do in occupied Europe. If a resistance fighter attacked a Nazi outpost somewhere in Czechoslovakia or in Poland, the whole street, the whole village, the whole town would be collectively punished. Well, that's exactly what's happening now at the hands of a country which calls itself, though we do not accept the nomenclature, the Jewish state. Imagine. What's the world doing about it? Precisely nothing. Neither the United Nations, blocked, even if it wanted to do something, by the overweening, overwhelming, absolutely decisive power of the United States, whose president, Barack Obama, told the world, though in an unguarded moment, not knowing that the microphone was live, that he couldn't even look at Netanyahu's face, that he was constantly being troubled and hounded by Netanyahu. Netanyahu and his supporters tried their best to destroy the presidency of Barack Obama. Obama knows the absolute truth about the Israel-Palestine question. He doesn't have the alibi the last guy did, Bush, of being an imbecile. Obama knows exactly what's wrong in the Middle East and what needs to be done to fix it. And yet, since this savage attack began a week ago, Obama has been four square shoulder to shoulder with the Netanyahu whose face he said he can't even bring himself to look at. Little Willie Hague, the British Foreign Secretary, imagining that we still had an empire so vast upon it the sun never set, because God would never trust the British in the dark. Little Willie Hague had his verbal gunboats out in the floor of the House this week, issuing forth his peremptory British demands that the Palestinian people stop fighting. What are they supposed to do? Just sit there quietly and die in besieged Gaza? I'll tell you what this is akin to. When the Jewish people in occupied Poland were blockaded in a ghetto which became famous throughout the world, the Warsaw Ghetto, they had a choice. They could die quietly one by one, or they could rise up and try and break the stranglehold of their besiegers, those who were quietly murdering them, as it turned out in the end, in their millions in the Holocaust. The Jewish people who rose up in the Warsaw Ghetto were not terrorists. They were freedom fighters. They were the Jewish resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. We look at that page now in history, and it shines luminous as an example of what any dignified people must do, have to do. Not to go quietly into the good night of death by starvation, death by deprivation, but to take up arms and by opposing seek to bring an end to the sea of troubles which is slowly drowning all of them. That's what the Jewish heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto did, and that's what the Palestinian people in Gaza are seeking to do. If this hadn't happened, do you think any of the news media, any of the politicians would be giving a toss about the ongoing attrition of the Palestinian people in Gaza? You think there'd be talks going on? Shuttle diplomacy going on? Of course not. Now, I don't know how this particular episode is going to end. But if it ends with the blockade still in place, then it won't have ended at all. As long as the people of Gaza are being besieged and starved to death, there will be resistance in Gaza. If there's resistance in Gaza, there will be no peace in the Middle East. And if there's no peace in the Middle East, there can be no peace in the world. Haven't we learned that simple equation yet? No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. You don't have to be Einstein to work that out.